In the early 1970s, the industrial heartland of South Wales was a world defined by the rhythms of coal and steel. Life in communities like Landersea, Port Talbot, and Neath was communal, grounded in the shared experiences of hard work and close-knit neighborhoods. The prevailing sense of danger was tangible, often associated with the mine or the factory, not with the shadows that fell on a Saturday night. This deeply rooted perception of communal safety, however, was about to be systematically and brutally dismantled by a predator who moved unseen among them. The case of the man who would be dubbed the Saturday Night Strangler would not only inflict a wound of terror that would fester for a generation, but would ultimately be closed by a scientific revolution, securing its place as a landmark case in the global history of criminology and forensic genetics. The narrative of this case, as constructed from a synthesis of forensic reports, criminological literature, and scholarly articles on forensic science, begins in the seemingly carefree summer of 1973. On a Saturday night in July, 16-year-old Geraldine Hughes went to a local dance hall in Landersea, a common weekend ritual for teenagers in the area. She was seen leaving with friends, but never made it home. The initial search was frantic, a community holding its breath. The discovery of her body in a dense, wooded area confirmed the worst fears. The cause of death was determined to be strangulation. The crime sent a shock wave of anxiety through the region, but it was viewed, for a moment, as a tragic, isolated incident. That illusion was shattered just weeks later. In August, another 16-year-old, Pauline Floyd, followed the same Saturday night routine, attending a social event in the same vicinity. Like Geraldine, she vanished on her walk home. Her body was found in a similar woodland setting, killed by the same method. The pattern was now undeniable and terrifying. A predator was actively hunting the young women of their community. Police realized they were not investigating two separate tragedies, but the work of a single serial offender. The third attack came a month later, in September. Sandra Newton, also 16, was walking home from a relative's house on a Saturday evening. Her body was discovered the next day. The modus operandi was identical. The victimology was starkly clear. Teenage girls, intercepted in a moment of vulnerability between a place of social gathering and the safety of home. The killer's signature was strangulation. The moniker, the Saturday Night Strangler, emerged, a name that chillingly captured the mundane, routine timing of his horrific acts. The South Wales Police launched one of the most extensive investigations in Welsh history. The scale of the inquiry, as documented in retrospective case studies, was immense for its time. Detectives and officers conducted thousands of interviews, compiling vast paper records and following up on every conceivable lead. A composite sketch was circulated. The community, once open and trusting, was now gripped by a palpable fear. Young women were escorted everywhere. The carefree Saturday night ritual was over. Amidst this intensive effort, a prime suspect was identified, a local man who could not provide a solid alibi and had been in the general area during one of the attacks. He was subjected to intense and repeated interrogations. However, the police of the 1970s were operating without the definitive tools of modern forensics. They had suspicion, circumstantial evidence, and intuition, but they lacked the irrefutable link needed for a prosecution. Despite their certainty, they could not build a strong enough case. Eventually, the active investigation wound down. The case went cold. For nearly 30 years, the story of the Saturday Night Strangler existed in a state of suspended animation. For the families of Geraldine, Pauline, and Sandra, it was a wound that could not heal, a story without an ending. For the community, it became a piece of dark folklore, a cautionary tale passed down through generations. For the man who had been the primary suspect, it was a shadow that followed him for the rest of his life, a public accusation never formally made, but implicitly understood. The paper case files gathered dust, a silent monument to a failure of justice. The second act of this narrative begins far from the wooded lanes of South Wales, in the world of molecular biology. The discovery of DNA fingerprinting by Sir Alec Jeffreys at the University of Leicester in 1984 was a watershed moment. Its first application to solve a murder case in 1986, leading to the conviction of Colin Pitchfork, heralded a new era in criminal justice. The ability to generate a unique genetic profile from biological material like blood or saliva offered a form of identification more powerful than any that had come before. As this technology matured, police forces across the United Kingdom began to establish national DNA databases, vast electronic libraries of genetic profiles. For cold cases, this offered an extraordinary opportunity to re-examine old evidence with new eyes. In the early 2000s, as part of a cold case review, the South Wales Police revisited the Strangler case. Forensic scientists, working with astonishing care, were able to locate and analyze biological evidence that had been meticulously preserved from the 1973 crime scenes. From this decades-old material, they successfully extracted a complete, high-quality DNA profile of the unknown killer. It was the killer's genetic ghost, a perfect digital signature captured at last. The profile was loaded and searched against the UK National DNA Database, NDNAD, which by then contained the profiles of millions of individuals. The hope was for a direct match, a cold hit that would instantly identify the perpetrator. The result, however, was disappointment. There was no match. The killer, it seemed, was not in the system. This could have been the final chapter, another frustrating dead end. But the investigative team, a collaboration between determined detectives and pioneering forensic scientists, refused to give up. They decided to attempt a novel and unproven strategy, one that had never before been used to solve a homicide investigation anywhere in the world: a familial DNA search. The scientific principle, as outlined in numerous forensic genetics journals that have since analyzed this case, is elegant. An individual shares approximately 50% of their DNA with a parent or child, and on average, 25% with a sibling. While the killer's exact profile was absent from the database, the profile of a close relative would exhibit a high number of shared genetic markers, specifically short tandem repeats, STRs, creating a significant partial match that would stand out from the millions of unrelated profiles. They were no longer looking for the killer himself. They were looking for his family. The database was searched again, this time with a new algorithm designed to flag these familial links. The search returned a hit. The killer's profile showed a strong partial match to a young man in the database named Paul Kappen, whose DNA had been taken for a minor, unrelated infraction. The number of shared markers was so high that it indicated a direct father-son relationship. After nearly 3 decades of anonymity, the Saturday Night Strangler suddenly had a surname: Kappen. The investigation now had a laser-like focus. Police delved into the life of Paul Kappen's father, a man named Joseph William Kappen. The biography that emerged was chillingly congruous with a potential offender profile. Joseph Kappen had been a doorman, bouncer, and security guard in the Port Talbot area during the 1970s. He was a local man, a familiar face in the very nightlife scene that his victims had frequented. This professional role is highly significant from a criminological perspective. It afforded him a position of authority and trust, a non-threatening presence that would have disarmed the very people he targeted. He was physically powerful, and his work gave him an intimate knowledge of the social patterns and geography of the area. He had died of lung cancer in 1990 at the age of 49 and was buried in a local cemetery. To forge the final, unbreakable link, investigators needed a sample of Joseph Kappen's DNA. The first thought was exhumation, a complex and sensitive process. However, before proceeding, detectives undertook a painstaking search of archival records. They discovered that Kappen had undergone a medical procedure years earlier and that a tissue sample, a pathology slide, had been preserved in hospital archives. This small, forgotten piece of medical history became the key to unlocking the case. Scientists were able to extract a DNA profile from the nearly 30-year-old tissue sample. This profile was then compared to the genetic ghost extracted from the 1973 crime scenes. The result was a perfect one-to-one match. There was no longer any doubt. Joseph Kappen was the Saturday Night Strangler. The posthumous criminal profile of Joseph Kappen is that of a wolf in sheep's clothing, a man who successfully compartmentalized his life. To his family and neighbors, he was a husband and father. In secret, he was a ruthless, sexually motivated predator. Criminological analysis of his actions points to an organized offender. He had a consistent victim type, a consistent modus operandi, and he operated in a specific geographic comfort zone. The choice of strangulation often indicates a psychological need for ultimate power and control over the victim. His ability to stop killing after 1973 and live an ostensibly normal life for another 17 years is a testament to his psychological ability to wall off his violent pathology from his everyday existence. The resolution of the Joseph Kappen case carries a profound and multifaceted legacy. First and foremost, it provided definitive answers to the families of Geraldine Hughes, Pauline Floyd, and Sandra Newton. The certainty of science brought a form of closure that 3 decades of mystery had denied them. Second, it completely and publicly exonerated the man who had lived for years as the primary suspect, finally lifting a burden of suspicion he had unjustly carried. Third, and most significantly for the world of criminal justice, it was the pioneering case that established familial DNA searching as a viable and powerful investigative tool. The success in Wales directly led to its adoption and refinement by law enforcement agencies globally, resulting in the resolution of countless other cold cases. This legacy, as explored in legal and bioethics journals, is not without complexity, sparking ongoing debates about genetic privacy, the rights of relatives, and the ethics of searching an individual's genetic code to find their kin. The story of Joseph Kappen is thus more than a tale of a serial killer. It is a chronicle of scientific evolution, a testament to investigative persistence, and a powerful narrative of how a secret, buried for decades, can be brought into the light by a ghost in the machine. A silent, unambiguous genetic signature that ultimately ensured the truth would be told. In 1994, the Republic of South Africa was a nation reborn. The formal end of apartheid ushered in an era of profound political and social transformation, a time of immense hope and monumental uncertainty. As the old structures of state control were dismantled and new, integrated institutions were forged, the country existed in a state of flux. This transition, while celebrated globally, created vacuums in social services and law enforcement. Within this landscape of newfound freedom and systemic strain, a predator emerged who would exploit the nation's vulnerabilities with terrifying precision. His name was Moses Sithole, and his case would become a defining chapter in the annals of South African criminology, a dark mirror reflecting the societal anxieties of a nation in turmoil. The criminal career of Moses Sithole, as documented in numerous academic journals on forensic psychology and criminology, is a study in methodical deception and predatory cunning. His modus operandi was chillingly consistent and inextricably linked to the socioeconomic conditions of post-apartheid South Africa. He targeted a specific and deeply vulnerable demographic, black women who were unemployed and actively seeking work. This choice was not random. It was a calculated exploitation of the economic desperation that affected a huge portion of the population. Sithole's ruse was one of false promise. He would present himself as a successful businessman, often claiming to be associated with a charitable foundation or a new enterprise looking to hire staff. His appearance was non-threatening, his demeanor persuasive. He would approach women in public spaces, offering them the prospect of a job, a powerful lure in a country with soaring unemployment. Having secured their interest, he would then insist on taking them to the supposed location of the business or for a preliminary interview. This was the critical moment of isolation. He would lead his victims away from the safety of populated areas, often walking with them for long distances into the veldt, the open, undeveloped grasslands that surround many South African cities. Once completely isolated, his persona would shift and the violent, underlying motivation would be revealed. The final act was one of ultimate control. His signature method, noted in countless forensic reports, was strangulation, almost always carried out using an item of the victim's own clothing. This detail is significant to criminal profilers, as it represents a form of depersonalization and a profound act of dominance, turning an intimate part of the victim's identity into the instrument of their death. He would then leave the bodies in the open felt, often partially concealed but discoverable. The psychological profile of Moses Sithole, constructed from extensive post-arrest interviews and court-ordered psychiatric evaluations, is central to the scholarly understanding of his case. Unlike some offenders who are products of low intelligence, Sithole was assessed as having average intelligence, but possessed a high degree of what criminologists term criminal cunning. He was manipulative, socially adept enough to enact his deceptions flawlessly, and keenly aware of his victims' vulnerabilities. His stated motivation, a focal point of analysis for forensic psychologists like Gerard Labuschag, was revenge. During his interrogations, Sithole constructed a coherent, albeit pathologically distorted, narrative to justify his actions. He claimed that his crimes were an act of vengeance against women, stemming from a past incident where he was accused of assault and arrested by a police officer with whom he had been romantically involved. He felt betrayed and unjustly imprisoned. In his mind, every woman he targeted became a symbolic substitute for this one woman and, by extension, for all women he believed had wronged him. This cognitive distortion, where the offender reframes their violent compulsions as a righteous or justified campaign, is a common feature in the psychology of mission-oriented serial killers. He was not just committing murder. In his own warped worldview, he was settling a score. This self-serving narrative coexisted with clear evidence of severe psychopathy. He displayed a complete lack of empathy or remorse, recounting the details of his crimes in a calm, detached manner. His ability to charm and manipulate his victims is a classic manifestation of the superficial charm associated with psychopathy. His crimes were not acts of frenzied rage, but were planned and executed with a chilling emotional coldness. The thrill for him was in the entire process: the hunt, the deception, the walk into the felt, and the ultimate act of control. The investigation into the string of murders that would eventually be attributed to Sithole was hampered by the immense challenges facing the newly formed South African Police Service, SAPS. The force was undergoing a difficult process of integration. Resources were stretched thin, and the nation was grappling with a massive increase in violent crime. The initial disappearances and discoveries were treated as isolated incidents by different police precincts. This lack of centralized data and interdepartmental communication allowed Sithole to continue his spree for a prolonged period. His geographic pattern, which earned him the moniker the ABC Killer, saw him move from Atteridgeville to Boksburg, B, and then to the Cleveland area of Johannesburg, C, making the connections between cases even more difficult for localized police units to spot. The breakthrough came when investigators, including pioneering South African profiler Mickey Pistorius, began to recognize the distinct signature linking the crimes. The consistent victimology, job-seeking women, the ruse, false employment, the location, the felt, and the specific method of murder were too similar to be coincidental. As police began to connect the dots and a profile of the suspect emerged, the case became a national priority. In a move characteristic of the narcissistic grandiosity often seen in such offenders, Sithole himself accelerated his downfall. Feeling the pressure of the investigation and craving recognition, he began making taunting phone calls to South African media outlets and even to police officials. In these calls, he claimed responsibility for the murders, revealing details that only the killer could have known. This act of hubris, while intended to display his power and mock his pursuers, provided investigators with crucial information and confirmed they were hunting a single offender. In August 1995, after being identified by a family member who recognized his story in the news, police cornered Moses Sithole in Johannesburg. A dramatic confrontation ensued. Rather than surrender, Sithole attacked the officers, was shot, and apprehended. His capture brought an end to a reign of terror that had left at least 38 victims in its wake. His trial was a landmark event. He remained defiant and unrepentant throughout the proceedings. He was convicted on multiple counts of murder, assault, and other crimes, receiving a sentence that totaled over 2,000 years, ensuring he would spend the rest of his life in prison. In conclusion, the scholarly analysis of the Moses Sithole case presents a powerful and disturbing portrait of a predator shaped by both personal pathology and societal context. He was a classic psychopath, a man driven by a vengeful, self-justifying narrative and a deep-seated need for dominance. Yet, his ability to operate so effectively for so long cannot be divorced from the realities of post-apartheid South Africa. He exploited the economic anxieties and the institutional seams of a nation in transition. The case of the ABC killer serves as a critical lesson in the importance of integrated policing, the power of criminal profiling, and the chilling reality that moments of great societal change, while filled with hope, can also create the shadows in which monsters hunt. At the turn of the 20th century, the field of professional nursing was in its infancy, establishing itself as a discipline built on pillars of compassion, trust, and scientific care. It was within this nascent world of healing that one of its own practitioners became a chilling embodiment of its antithesis. Jane Toppan, known publicly by the disarmingly cheerful moniker Jolly Jane, moved through the sick rooms and households of New England not as a healer, but as one of history's most prolific quiet killers. Her case, extensively documented in historical and criminological scholarship, is a profound study in the pathology of medical murder, the ultimate betrayal of professional trust, and the complex psychological motivations of a predator who hid in plain sight. The foundational analysis of any criminal profile begins with developmental history. In Jane Toppan's early life, as pieced together by historical researchers, is a textbook case of trauma and instability. Born Honora Kelly in 1857, her childhood was marked by tragedy and institutionalization. Her mother died when she was very young, and her father, a man described in historical accounts as abusive and mentally unstable, surrendered his children to the Boston Female Asylum. This early experience of abandonment and institutional life is consistently identified in developmental psychology as a significant risk factor for the formation of severe attachment disorders and personality pathologies. At a young age, she was indentured to the household of Mrs. and Toppan, where she took on a new name but remained in a liminal state, neither a true daughter nor merely a servant. This environment, scholars suggest, likely compounded her feelings of inadequacy and fostered a deep-seated resentment and a desperate, unfulfilled need for attention and control. Her entry into the nursing profession in 1885 provided her with a socially acceptable role and, more sinisterly, unprecedented access to the vulnerable. She trained at Cambridge Hospital, where she earned her nickname Jolly Jane for her outgoing and cheerful demeanor. This superficial charm is a trait frequently observed in individuals with psychopathic personality structures, a social mask that conceals a profound lack of empathy and a calculating inner world. It was during her training that her criminal behavior is believed to have begun. Her modus operandi was subtle, insidious, and perfectly suited to her environment. Her weapon of choice was poison, specifically morphine and atropine, drugs to which she had easy access. The scholarly analysis of Toppan's method is crucial to understanding her psychology. Poisoning is a low-visibility method of murder that allows the perpetrator a degree of emotional and physical distance. For Toppan, however, it served a different, more intimate purpose. She did not simply administer a lethal dose and walk away. Criminological profiles of her case emphasize that she was a thrill-motivated killer. Her primary gratification came from the power she wielded over her victims. She would administer carefully calibrated doses of morphine to bring her patients to the brink of death, then use atropine to revive them, only to push them back towards the edge. This cycle of control, of holding a life in her hands and oscillating between savior and destroyer, was the core of her pathological thrill. She was the central actor in a life-and-death drama of her own creation. Her victimology began with those placed directly in her care: the elderly, the infirm, and the post-surgical patients who were utterly dependent on her. These were opportunistic crimes, facilitated by the trust inherent in the nurse-patient relationship. No one questioned the cheerful nurse when a frail patient took a turn for the worse. But her selection of victims soon escalated beyond the professional sphere, a progression that demonstrates the deepening of her pathology. She began to target her friends, her colleagues, and even the foster family who had raised her. These were no longer crimes of opportunity, but deeply personal acts of revenge and control. Her actions toward her foster sister, Elizabeth Toppan Brigham, are a poignant example. After Elizabeth fell ill, Jane rushed to her bedside, ostensibly to care for her. Instead, she administered a fatal dose of poison. This act is interpreted by profilers not just as a murder, but as a symbolic act of eliminating a rival, a woman who had the familial belonging that Jane, as an indentured servant, was always denied. The psychological profile of Jane Toppan, constructed from her own extensive confessions and historical analysis, points to a complex constellation of disorders. While a modern diagnosis is impossible, her behavior aligns with traits of psychopathy, severe narcissistic personality disorder, and borderline personality disorder. Her confession after her capture is one of the most revealing in the annals of serial crime and a cornerstone of her scholarly case file. She reportedly told investigators, "That is my ambition, to have killed more people, helpless people, than any other man or woman who ever lived." This statement reveals a profound narcissistic grandiosity and a competitive, pathological drive. Her murders were, in her mind, accomplishments, a way to achieve a sense of power and notoriety that her station in life otherwise denied her. Furthermore, her actions after administering the poison reveal a disturbing need for a twisted form of intimacy. It is documented in case reports that she would climb into bed with her female victims as they lay dying. This final, chilling act is understood by forensic psychologists as a pathological substitute for the genuine human connection she was incapable of forming. In their final, helpless moments, she could impose a form of intimacy and closeness on her victims that they could not reject. The unraveling of her career came not from medical oversight, which at the time was minimal, but from the suspicions of a grieving family. In the summer of 1901, Jane Toppan rented a cottage and systematically poisoned the entire Davis family, who were her landlords. After the deaths of the mother and two of her daughters, the surviving family members, led by Alden Davis's son-in-law, grew deeply suspicious. They ordered a private toxicological examination on the body of the final victim, which revealed lethal quantities of morphine and atropine. Faced with this irrefutable scientific evidence, Jane Toppan was arrested. The legal outcome of her case is as significant as her crimes. She was not convicted of murder. Instead, in 1902, she was found not guilty by reason of insanity. The jury and the court accepted the psychiatric testimony that she was morally insane, unable to distinguish right from wrong in the context of her compulsive actions. This verdict is a landmark in historical forensic psychiatry. She was committed to the Taunton Insane Hospital, where she remained for the rest of her life, dying in 1938. In conclusion, the scholarly legacy of Jane Toppan is that of the quintessential angel of death, a medical professional who used their skills and the trust placed in them to become a prolific predator. Her case serves as a critical study in the motivations of female serial killers, who often employ quiet, low-visibility methods like poison and target those in their immediate circle. She is a chilling illustration of how a history of profound emotional and social deprivation can contribute to the formation of a personality so disordered that the act of taking a human life becomes the only means of achieving a sense of power, control, and perverse intimacy. Jolly Jane remains a subject of intense academic fascination. a dark figure who haunts the history of medicine and criminology, reminding us that the greatest dangers can sometimes come disguised as the most dedicated caregivers. In the late 1980s, the nation of Japan was experiencing the peak of its bubble economy, a period of immense prosperity that reinforced a deeply ingrained cultural narrative of social order and public safety. This national self-image of a secure and harmonious society was shattered by a series of crimes so disturbing and psychologically complex that they would become a permanent case study in the annals of global criminology. The perpetrator, Tsutomu Miyazaki, became a figure of intense national horror. But in the detached analysis of scholarly literature, he represents a chilling nexus of profound social withdrawal, severe personality disorders, and the catastrophic failure to distinguish between violent fantasy and reality. The criminal profile of Tsutomu Miyazaki, as documented in forensic case studies and criminological analyses, is one of a highly specific, escalating predator. Between 1988 and 1989, he targeted prepubescent girls, ranging in age from 4 to 7 years old. His modus operandi involved a degree of planning and deception. He would approach his victims in his car, often presenting himself as a friendly figure or a photographer, a ruse that exploited the innocence and trust of young children. Once a child was lured into his vehicle, he would drive to a remote, secluded area to commit the murder. While this initial pattern points to an organized offender, it was his post-mortem activities that provided forensic psychologists and psychiatrists with the most profound insight into the unique structure of his pathology. After the initial crime, Miyazaki's actions deviated into a pattern of complex ritualism. He would transport the victim's remains, sometimes to wooded areas, other times back to his own small, cluttered apartment. There, as documented in court psychiatric reports and case analyses, he engaged in a series of acts of profound desecration. A central feature of his pathology, emphasized in academic profiles, was the fetishistic component of his crimes. He dismembered the bodies, keeping certain parts as trophies. This act of trophy-taking is a well-documented behavior in serial offenders, understood by criminologists as a method of preserving the crime and allowing the offender to relive the experience, thereby maintaining a sense of power and control. Furthermore, Miyazaki meticulously documented his actions, taking photographs and creating videos of the victim's remains. This act of recording was not merely for posterity. It was an integral part of his psychological feedback loop, further blurring the line between the violent fantasies he consumed and the real-world atrocities he committed. The social and psychological context of Miyazaki's life is critical to any scholarly understanding of his case. He lived a life of extreme social isolation, a condition that resonates with the Japanese social phenomenon of hikikomori, or acute social withdrawal. His small room was filled with an enormous library of over 5,000 videotapes, a collection that included anime, horror films, and other media. The popular press quickly labeled him the otaku killer, simplistically linking his crimes to his obsessive interest in anime and manga. However, scholarly analysis, particularly from sociological and psychological perspectives, reframes this relationship. His obsessive media consumption is not seen as the cause of his violence, but rather as a symptom of his profound alienation and inability to form human relationships. His apartment was a fortress of fantasy, a world he retreated into to escape a reality in which he felt inadequate and rejected. This sense of inadequacy is often linked in psychiatric profiles to a congenital deformity of his hands, specifically fused carpal bones, which made it difficult for him to fully open and close his fists. This physical difference was reportedly a source of childhood teasing and contributed to his lifelong feelings of social rejection and simmering rage. His crimes, therefore, can be interpreted as a monstrous form of compensation, a way for a man who felt powerless and invisible in the real world to exert ultimate power and control in his own dark, ritualistic theater. A particularly bizarre and significant aspect of the case was Miyazaki's communication with the victims' families and the media. Adopting the pseudonym Yuko, he sent a series of taunting, cryptic postcards. In one of the most disturbing acts documented in the case file, he mailed a box to the family of one of his victims containing some of the child's cremated remains and teeth. This act of direct communication with the families is interpreted by criminal profilers as a manifestation of narcissistic grandiosity. He was not content to commit his crimes in secret. He had a profound psychological need for his actions to be acknowledged, to inject himself into the lives of his victims' families, and to transform his private rituals into a public spectacle of terror. Miyazaki's eventual capture in July 1989 was almost incidental, not the result of a direct investigation into the murders. He was caught in the act of attempting to assault another young girl, and it was only during the subsequent investigation that the contents of his apartment and his car linked him to the string of unsolved child murders. The discovery of his vast video library and the photographic trophies of his victims shocked the nation and provided investigators with undeniable proof of his guilt. The trial of Tsutomu Miyazaki became a landmark event in Japanese legal and psychiatric history. The central conflict of the trial was the question of his criminal responsibility. His defense team argued that he was not legally sane, proposing that he suffered from a severe mental illness, such as schizophrenia or multiple personality disorder, now known as dissociative identity disorder, or DID. They argued that a separate, evil personality was responsible for the crimes, and therefore Miyazaki himself could not be held fully culpable. The prosecution, supported by extensive psychiatric evaluation, countered this claim. The consensus among the court-appointed psychiatrists, as detailed in legal scholarship on the case, was that while Miyazaki suffered from severe personality disorders and profound paraphilias, he was not psychotic in a way that would negate his understanding of his actions. He did not suffer from delusions or hallucinations that prevented him from appreciating the nature and wrongfulness of his conduct. He planned his crimes, took steps to avoid detection, and understood the consequences. The court ultimately accepted this assessment, finding him competent to stand trial and fully responsible for his actions. He was convicted and sentenced to death. After years of appeals, Tsutomu Miyazaki was executed in 2008. In conclusion, the scholarly legacy of the Tsutomu Miyazaki case is multifaceted. He is a textbook example of a serial offender driven by a complex mix of sadistic fantasy, paraphilic urges, and fetishistic ritualism. His case highlights the critical distinction made in forensic psychiatry between severe personality disorders and legal insanity. Furthermore, it serves as a powerful, albeit extreme, case study on the potential dangers of profound social isolation and the ways in which a life devoid of genuine human connection can allow violent fantasy to completely supplant reality. He remains a dark figure in criminal history, a testament to the fact that even in a society that perceives itself as perfectly ordered, the most profound and disturbing forms of human pathology can fester in the lonely rooms on its margins. In the landscape of serial criminal studies, certain cases stand out not for their complexity, but for their brutal simplicity and the unique legal dilemmas they present. The case of Carl Eugene Watts is one such cornerstone, a subject of analysis in criminological and legal scholarship. He was not a criminal mastermind, nor did his profile fit the popular archetype of the brilliant, elusive predator. Instead, academic case studies portray Watts as a predator of chilling persistence and low cunning, a man whose reign of terror across two states was defined by explosive, random violence and culminated in one of the most controversial immunity agreements in modern American criminal justice history. Carl Eugene Watts, known to a terrified public as the Sunday morning slasher, operated with a modus operandi that is a focal point of his criminal profile. His method, as documented in forensic case files and criminological textbooks, was the blitz attack. Unlike predators who engage in prolonged stalking or elaborate ruses, Watts relied on surprise and overwhelming force. His victimology was broad. His targets were almost exclusively women, but they varied widely in age, race, and appearance. What connected them was not a specific physical type, but opportunity and vulnerability. He was a hunter of circumstance. He would stalk potential victims in their apartments, follow them from bus stops, or break into their homes as they slept. The attacks were sudden, frenzied, and horrifically violent. His weapons were varied but intimate: knives for stabbing and slashing, ligatures for strangulation, and at times his bare hands to drown his victims. A crucial element in the scholarly analysis of Watts's motivation is the nature of the violence itself. In many of his documented attacks, sexual assault was not the primary objective. It was either an afterthought or did not occur at all. Criminological profiles, such as those found in foundational texts like Hickey's Serial Murderers and Their Victims, classify Watts as a thrill-seeking killer. For him, the ultimate gratification was derived from the hunt, the stalk, and the act of murder itself. The power, the dominance, and the quenching of a compulsive rage was the goal. The violence was not a means to an end. It was the end. This places him in a specific, terrifying category of offender, one for whom the act of extinguishing a life is the core psychological driver. The psychiatric and psychological profiles of Karl Watts, pieced together from court-ordered evaluations and his own statements, paint a picture of a deeply disturbed individual from an early age. A significant biographical detail, noted in case studies, is that he contracted meningitis as a child, an illness that led to learning disabilities and behavioral problems. Throughout his youth, he was described as socially awkward and prone to fantasizing. Crucially, intelligence assessments consistently placed him in the dull normal or borderline range. This finding is critical as it dismantles any notion of a sophisticated planner. His success as a predator was not a function of high intelligence, but of relentless compulsion and a predatory intuition for identifying opportune moments. When he was eventually compelled to speak about his crimes, his statements provided forensic psychologists with a clear window into his psychopathology. He confessed to his murders in a flat, unemotional tone, a detachment characteristic of individuals with severe psychopathic traits and a profound lack of empathy. He offered a chillingly simplistic rationalization for his murderous rage, a cognitive distortion that is a hallmark of such offenders. He claimed that he was triggered when women gave him an evil eye. This externalization of blame is a classic psychological mechanism for a violent offender, transferring responsibility for his internal, pathological rage onto his victims. In his mind, their perceived glance was a provocation that justified his horrific response. He did not see them as people. He saw them as conduits for a look that enraged him, thereby dehumanizing them and granting himself permission to kill. The investigative and legal saga of Karl Watts is what cements his case in academic study. In the early 1980s, law enforcement in Texas was faced with a series of brutal, seemingly unconnected murders of women. They suspected Watts, who was already in custody for burglary with intent to commit murder after being caught attacking two women who survived. However, the random nature of his crimes and his practice of leaving little forensic evidence made it exceedingly difficult to build a prosecutable murder case against him for any single crime. They were certain he was their man, but they lacked the evidence to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt in court. This investigative dead end led Texas prosecutors to make one of the most debated legal decisions in the history of serial crime. In 1982, they offered Karl Watts a deal. In exchange for his full and truthful confession to all of his crimes in Texas, he would be granted full immunity from prosecution for those murders. He would plead guilty to the burglary charge and receive a 60-year sentence, which they believed would keep him in prison for life. Faced with the choice of either letting a serial killer potentially walk free or clearing dozens of unsolved homicides and bringing a form of closure to grieving families, they chose the latter. Watts accepted the deal. He then proceeded to confess, in his characteristically detached manner, to the murders of 13 women, providing details that only the killer could have known. He solved cases that had haunted detectives for years, but the cost was that he would never be held legally accountable for taking those lives. This immunity agreement is a frequent subject in law review articles and criminal justice ethics textbooks. It represents a stark example of the clash between prosecutorial pragmatism and the pursuit of absolute justice. For 2 decades, it seemed the deal would hold. However, the Texas sentencing laws of the era were more lenient than anticipated. Due to mandatory release provisions, it became clear that Carl Watts would be freed from prison in 2006. The prospect of a confessed serial killer being released back into the public spurred Michigan authorities into action. Watts had lived in Michigan before his Texas spree, and police there had long suspected him in a series of similar, unsolved murders from the 1970s. The Texas immunity deal did not apply across state lines. In a race against time, Michigan cold case detectives reopened their files. They located a man named Joseph Foy, who had survived one of Watts's attacks in 1979. Foy had witnessed Watts murder his roommate, Gloria Steele. For decades, his testimony was not enough, but now, with Watts's impending release providing a new urgency, prosecutors believed they could build a case. In 2004, nearly 25 years after the crime, Carl Eugene Watts was put on trial for the murder of Gloria Steele. The eyewitness testimony of Joseph Foy was the cornerstone of the prosecution. Watts was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The following years saw him convicted of another Michigan murder, that of Helen Dutcher, ensuring he would never be free again. He died in a Michigan prison in 2007. The story of Carl Eugene Watts, as documented in scholarly sources, is thus a narrative in 2 distinct parts. The first is a clinical profile of a low-functioning, thrill-seeking, psychopathic predator whose random, blitz-style attacks terrorize communities. The second is a complex legal case study that explores the outer limits of prosecutorial discretion, the controversial nature of immunity agreements, and the enduring potential for justice in cold cases. He was not a monster of fiction. He was a real and terrifying product of psychological damage and compulsive violence. A man whose dark legacy serves as a permanent and cautionary tale in the annals of criminology. In the 1990s, the nation of Colombia was a landscape fractured by violence. Decades of internal armed conflict between the state, paramilitary groups, and guerrilla factions had created a pervasive state of social disorganization. In the gaps left by a retreating state authority, particularly in impoverished rural regions, a profound sense of lawlessness festered. This environment gave rise to a grim phenomenon known in sociological literature as limpieza social, or social cleansing, where so-called undesirables were targeted and eliminated. It was within this cauldron of chaos and institutional neglect that the most vulnerable segment of the population, the street children known as gamines, found themselves utterly exposed. They were the children of poverty and displacement, often invisible to a society preoccupied with its own survival. And it was through this world of forgotten boys that a predator moved, a man who would exploit the nation's turmoil to become what criminological history now recognizes as one of the most prolific serial murderers ever documented. His name was Luis Alfredo Garavito Cubillos, but his legacy is inscribed under a different title, La Bestia. This is not merely a recounting of his atrocities, but a clinical examination of his case, constructed solely from the data and analysis present in academic and scholarly sources. It is a study of his methods, his psychological profile, and the societal conditions that enabled his reign of terror. Case studies document Garavito as a drifter, a man with no fixed place in the world, which allowed him to become a phantom. Born in 1957, his early life, as he would later recount in extensive confessions analyzed by forensic psychologists, was marked by severe and chronic physical abuse at the hands of his father. Such profound early life trauma is consistently identified in developmental psychology as a significant risk factor for the later development of severe personality disorders, including psychopathy and violent paraphilias. As an adult, he moved through the country taking odd jobs, but his true vocation was predation. He developed a modus operandi that was terrifyingly effective, a systematic process of hunting that he refined over years. Criminological analysis of Garavito's methods reveals him to be a highly organized, mission-oriented predator. His primary tool was deception. He employed a range of disguises and ruses, adapting his persona to fit the local environment and the expectations of his young, destitute victims. He would present himself as a monk, a charity worker, a farmer, a street vendor, or even a man with a physical disability, all roles designed to elicit sympathy and disarm suspicion. He understood the psychology of his victims with chilling precision. He targeted boys between the ages of 8 and 16, almost exclusively from poor, rural backgrounds. These were children who were often unsupervised, working to support their families, or who had run away from abusive homes. They were desperate, and Garavito exploited that desperation. The lure was always simple, an offer too good for a child in their circumstances to refuse. A small amount of money, a piece of candy, a soft drink, or the promise of a job. Once a boy had accepted his offer, the second phase of his method began: isolation. Garavito would lead his victim on a long walk, often for hours, into a remote, desolate area, a sugarcane field, a ravine, or an abandoned construction site. This served a dual purpose. It exhausted the child physically and removed him entirely from any possibility of being seen or rescued. During these long walks, he would engage the child, gaining his trust and assessing his vulnerabilities. When they were completely isolated, the final, violent phase commenced. Forensic reports and his own detailed confessions, which form the core of the academic case file, describe a consistent and ritualistic pattern of assault and murder. He would bind the victim's hands and feet. The violence that followed was extreme, far exceeding what was necessary to cause death, pointing to a deep-seated sadistic motivation. The cause of death was almost invariably a wound to the throat. Post-mortem examinations noted that the bodies were often found kneeling and frequently showed signs of having been deliberately posed after death. He would then conceal the body in a shallow grave, often leaving a piece of the victim's clothing or a personal item nearby. This entire process, from the initial lure to the final concealment, demonstrates a high degree of planning, control, and forensic awareness, all hallmarks of an organized serial killer. His geographic mobility was a key factor in the longevity of his killing spree. He did not remain in one area. Instead, he moved methodically across Colombia, committing murders in at least 11 of the country's 32 departments. This nomadic pattern, documented in criminal justice studies of the case, made it nearly impossible for the fragmented and under-resourced local police forces to connect the disappearances. A missing child in one department was an isolated tragedy, not part of a nationwide pattern of predation. He exploited the very fractures in the Colombian state to remain invisible, a ghost leaving a trail of shallow graves that no one was yet piecing together. The psychological profile of Luis Garavito, as constructed from his extensive confessions and psychiatric evaluations cited in scholarly texts, is that of a classic, severe psychopath. He demonstrated a profound lack of empathy, describing his horrific crimes in meticulous, unemotional detail. During his interrogations, he provided investigators with maps and diagrams, leading them to dozens of burial sites with a calm and cooperative demeanor that forensic psychologists identify as a manifestation of psychopathic grandiosity and a need for control. He viewed his victims not as human beings, but as objects for the satisfaction of his violent, pederastic impulses. Furthermore, his psychological justifications are of significant interest to criminologists studying cognitive distortions in offenders. Garavito attempted to rationalize his actions by blaming his victims, claiming they were from broken homes, or by attributing his crimes to a satanic cult or an alter ego. These claims were not found to be indicative of a genuine psychotic disorder, such as dissociative identity disorder. Rather, they are interpreted by forensic experts as self-serving fabrications, a common tactic used by psychopathic individuals to deflect responsibility and mitigate their own culpability. He knew precisely what he was doing and constructed elaborate fictions to frame his own compulsions as something beyond his control. His motivations were a toxic fusion of sadistic pleasure, power, and the fulfillment of a violent pederastic paraphilia, all filtered through a psychopathic personality structure incapable of remorse. The unraveling of Garavito's reign of terror did not come from a single piece of brilliant detective work, but from the slow, horrifying accumulation of evidence. In late 1997, a mass grave containing the remains of over 20 young boys was discovered in the city of Pereira. The sheer number of bodies in one location finally triggered a coordinated, high-level investigation. Forensic analysis confirmed that the boys had all been victims of a single predator. As investigators began to connect this discovery with unsolved cases of missing children across the country, the terrifying scale of the problem began to emerge. They were not hunting multiple killers. They were hunting one man. Even so, Garavito was not captured as a direct result of this investigation. In April 1999, he was apprehended on suspicion of an attempted assault. It was only during his interrogation for this lesser crime that inconsistencies in his stories and his resemblance to a composite sketch circulated by the task force led investigators to suspect they had La Bestia in their custody. Faced with the evidence, Garavito began to confess. His confession was unprecedented in the history of criminal justice. He calmly admitted to the murders of 193 boys, though the final number for which he was formally charged was lower. He provided investigators with detailed maps, drawn from memory, pinpointing the locations of dozens of undiscovered graves across the country. His cooperation was total, a final act of control and a display of his grandiose sense of importance. He was the author of this vast narrative of death, and he was now revealing its chapters. The legal outcome of the Garavito case is a subject of significant analysis in legal and human rights scholarship concerning Colombia. Despite confessing to nearly 200 murders, he was tried and convicted for 138. The Colombian Penal Code at the time, however, placed a maximum cap on prison sentences. Garavito was sentenced to 40 years, the highest penalty allowed. This sentence was then further reduced due to his cooperation with authorities and laws rewarding good behavior, leading to a potential release that has been the subject of intense public and academic debate. The case starkly highlights the collision between the procedural limits of a legal system and the sheer scale of mass atrocity committed by a single individual. In the end, the case of Luis Garavito serves as a harrowing, scholarly monument. He is a data point on the extreme end of human malevolence, a study in how profound childhood trauma can, in some individuals, curdle into a predatory psychopathy of unimaginable proportions. But more than that, his story is inseparable from the story of the nation he stalked. He was a predator who flourished in the shadows of societal collapse. His victims were the forgotten casualties of poverty and conflict, children made invisible by the chaos surrounding them. La Bestia is not just a monster from a nightmare. He is a dark reflection of a time and place, a case study demonstrating with horrifying clarity that the most monstrous acts are often perpetrated against the most vulnerable, in those places where the structures of society have failed.